On a quiet Sunday night in August 1971, while global markets were closed and most of the world was watching television, a single announcement quietly changed how money works. There were no sirens, no emergency meetings broadcast live, no visible panic, just a man, a camera, and a sentence that would outlive him. Richard Nixon looked straight into the camera and called it a temporary measure. The United States would no longer convert dollars into gold. No vote from Congress. No approval from allies. The promise behind the world's money was simply withdrawn. That night, gold didn't collapse. Markets didn't crash. Most people went to bed unaware that something fundamental had just snapped. But from that moment on, money was no longer anchored to metal. It was anchored to policy, power, and trust. From that moment on, money stopped being a rule everyone followed and became a decision someone controlled. To understand why Richard Nixon's decision mattered, you first need to understand the promise the world was built on after World War II. In 1944, exhausted economies gathered in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, and agreed on a simple rule. Currencies would be pegged to the US dollar, and the US dollar would be pegged to gold. For decades, it worked beautifully. Trade expanded. Confidence grew. The dollar became the backbone of global commerce, because everyone believed it could always be exchanged for something real. Gold wasn't just metal. It was trust made physical, but hidden inside that promise was a flaw big enough to break the system. The world needed more dollars to trade and grow, which meant the United States had to keep printing them. Yet, every dollar printed was also a promise that it could be turned into gold on demand. It was like running a bank that keeps accepting deposits, while quietly realizing the vault isn't big enough anymore. As long as nobody panics, everything looks fine. But if too many people show up at once, the math stops working. By the late 1960s, foreign governments were starting to notice. Dollars were piling up overseas. Gold was quietly flowing out of US vaults. And the promise that once stabilized the world was becoming a ticking clock. The warning signs didn't arrive with headlines. They arrived quietly, in balance sheets and vault inventories. While Americans debated war and elections, dollars were piling up abroad, far from Washington's control. The world was holding more US money than the United States could honestly back. At first, the system survived on habit. Everyone assumed the gold was there. But assumptions don't last forever in finance. One by one, the foreign governments began testing the promise, exchanging paper dollars for physical gold. Each transaction was polite, each shipment was legal, and each one made the math uglier. Inside the White House, the danger was becoming impossible to ignore. This was no longer about theory or ideology. If enough countries demanded gold at the same time, the vaults would empty. And once the vaults were empty, the dollar would be exposed for what it really was: confidence without collateral. This is where Richard Nixon enters the story not as a monetary philosopher, but as a politician staring down multiple clocks. Inflation was rising. The Vietnam War was bleeding money. An election was coming. And every week of delay increased the odds of a global panic with America at the center. So in August 1971, Nixon retreated to Camp David with a small circle of advisors. No reporters. No speeches. Just a locked-door conversation about a system that could not survive daylight. The conclusion was brutal in its simplicity. The promise had to be suspended before it collapsed on its own. The plan was assembled quickly. Close the gold window. Freeze wages and prices to calm voters. Add an import surcharge to protect jobs. And above all, announce it while the markets were asleep. Nixon wasn't fixing the system. He was buying time. And history is very clear about one thing: borrowed time always comes with interest. On Sunday night, August 15th, 1971, American households settled in front of their televisions, expecting another routine presidential address. The markets were closed. Wall Street was quiet. It was the perfect time to say something that couldn't be taken back. Nixon spoke calmly, confidently, almost reassuringly. He framed the announcement as a defense of the American worker, a strike against speculators, and a necessary step to stabilize the economy. The language was careful. The tone was firm. And right in the middle of it all came the sentence that mattered. The United States would temporarily suspend the convertibility of the dollar into gold. Temporary. A word that sounds harmless until you realize how often temporary solutions quietly become permanent realities. There was no debate that night. No international consultation. No vote from the rest of the world whose currencies were chained to the dollar. The promise that underpinned global money was unilaterally rewritten. Live on television. And here's the genius of the timing. By announcing it while markets were closed, Nixon denied panic its favorite fuel, speed. There would be no immediate bank runs. No instant price discovery. No overnight chaos. By the time trading resumed, the world would wake up inside a new system. Nixon didn't announce the end of Bretton Woods. He didn't have to. He simply removed the anchor and let the system drift on its own. When markets reopened, nothing exploded. That was the trick. There was no single crash. No dramatic collapse to point at. Bretton Woods didn't die screaming. It died quietly, by becoming impossible to operate. Without gold convertibility, fixed exchange rates lost their meaning. Countries could no longer trust the old pegs. Because the promise behind them was gone, currencies began to wobble, then float. What had been rules turned into negotiations. What had been discipline turned into discretion. Money had crossed an invisible line. It was no longer constrained by metal. It was constrained only by policy and by how much inflation the public would tolerate before losing trust. For governments, this felt like freedom. Budgets could expand. Crises could be postponed. Pain could be delayed. For ordinary people, it felt very different. Prices moved faster than wages. Savings lost purchasing power. Stability became something you remembered, not something you expected. And here's the uncomfortable irony. The decision meant to protect confidence now depended entirely on confidence. With no anchor beneath it, money floated on belief alone. And belief, as history would soon remind everyone, is fragile. The effects didn't hit all at once. They never do. Instead, they crept in quietly, disguised as adjustments. Prices rose a little faster. Wages lagged a little more. Governments borrowed a little easier. And year by year, people learned that money no longer stood still. The 1,970 seconds made it impossible to ignore. Inflation surged. Oil shocks ripped through economies. Central banks chased prices that refused to slow down. For the first time in modern memory, people realized that holding cash was no longer safe. It was a guaranteed way to fall behind. And that realization changed behavior. If money loses value over time, you stop saving it. You invest it. You speculate with it. You push it into assets houses. Stocks. Anything that might outrun inflation. What began as monetary flexibility slowly turned into asset inflation. This is where the modern boom and bust cycle finds its rhythm. Easy money fuels growth. Growth feeds confidence. Confidence inflates bubbles. And when the bubbles burst, the response is almost always the same. More money. More promises. More time bought. The winners tend to be those closest to asset inflation. The losers tend to be those paid in wages. And slowly, inequality stops looking like an accident and starts looking like a feature of the system. All of it traces back to a moment when money stopped being a rule and became a tool. History rarely offers clean villains. Richard Nixon did not wake up one morning determined to kill gold. He acted under pressure, facing a system that demanded either honesty or survival and could not tolerate both at once. In the short term, the decision worked. Panic was avoided. The dollar survived. America bought time. In the long term, the cost was invisible but enormous. Money became elastic. Debt became policy. And every future crisis learned the same lesson. When rules hurt, Rewrite them. This is the world you live in now. A world where money floats on belief. Central banks manage confidence. And stability depends less on gold and more on trust in institutions that promise they know when to stop. So the final question isn't whether Nixon was right or wrong. It's whether a system that survives by breaking its own promises can ever truly be stable. Because once money stops being a rule, it never stops being used as a weapon.